So for this week on CyberSchool, we're going to be going over auto provisioning and really talking about all about auto provisioning. We've covered a lot of our devices over the past couple of weeks as we've been going through CyberSchool, but I figured it was a good time to start talking about some of the features that our devices have. Because this is a common question we get in both sales and in support. It's just about auto provisioning. What is it? How do you set it up? What are the reasons you would want to use it? So I figured this would be a good topic to cover this week. So let's talk about auto provisioning. So what is auto provisioning? Auto provisioning is basically the automatic setup of devices. And that's done by when the devices go and boot up, they'll actually go and download their configuration files or templates, audio files, and even firmware files. You know, there's really no limit to what the units can actually download when they're auto provisioning. It's really just based on what the devices actually support. Whether it's one configuration file, multiple configuration files, audio files, firmware, you know, what have you. As long as the device supports it, it can be downloaded over auto provisioning. So it's a really, really useful feature when you're dealing with larger installations and larger setups. It'd really be a pain to go through and set up 100 speakers manually. So if you do a little bit of due diligence beforehand with setting up all of the different templates and the auto provisioning server, it really becomes a plug and play type scenario where if you do your due diligence and you get everything set up properly, you can just go install all the speakers and plug them in, and you're good to go. You know, they'll set up themselves, they'll register properly. It makes it a lot easier. And it really becomes much easier, and there's a better incentive to do it as you add more units. You know, if you're just dealing with a small handful of units, there's not too much incentive to go and set up auto provisioning. But if you're dealing with a huge enterprise deployment or something at a university where you're setting up hundreds of devices, auto provisioning is a godsend. It makes your life so easy. So when you're actually setting up auto provisioning, it's not only setting up all the files, but you need to pick a server. And there's basically two different types of servers that you can load all of these different files onto. And they can be downloaded either using TFTP, which is Trivial File Transport Protocol, or HTTP, Hypertext Transport Protocol, or HTTPS, Hypertext Transport Protocol Secure. And so basically that limits it to two different servers. You've either got your standard TFTP server or your HTTP/HTTPS server. So you can really accomplish either the standard HTTP or the secure version with the HTTP server. And really the differentiation between picking either the TFTP server or the HTTP or HTTPS server would be how secure you want the system to be and whether it's going over the open internet or not. If you're just setting up speakers at, say, a middle school or an elementary school, you're not really dealing with super secure files, and it's all getting downloaded on the local network, a TFTP server would be fine. But if you're setting up, say, you know, multiple locations across the country and you're downloading files across the open internet, you would want to do that securely, just in case you're subject to a man-in-the-middle attack and somebody could potentially hijack your credentials. So you would want to do it all over HTTPS so everything's encrypted. So that's really the kind of differentiation factor between picking a particular server, whether you really need it to be secure or not, and where the download is actually occurring, if it's local network or if it's going to be going across the open internet. So, of course, the servers can be hosted in the cloud. You can put them, you know, pretty much anywhere, whether it's, you know, on your favorite hosting service, or you can just get an extra IP address from your internet provider and throw it up at your, you know, at your house, or say your installation service, you know, your headquarters. You know, your local telecom supporter might have their own HTTP or HTTPS server that they can host the files on there for you. Say if they're doing the installation, that's pretty common to run into. This is also commonly known as Autoprov. That's kind of what we call it. There's a couple different industry standards in terms of the name, but it all really relates to auto provisioning. But for today's purpose, we're going to call it Autoprov because that's what we call it in the CyberData world. And a common question that we get in regards to this feature is, does it work on all CyberData VoIP products? It does indeed. Any CyberData product that can connect to the network and would, say, register with a SIP server, whether it's an intercom, a speaker, a strobe, pretty much anything like that will support auto provisioning. Things that won't support auto provisioning would say be like our network dual door strike relay, our network switches, stuff that really you wouldn't really consider a VoIP device. But if it's considered a VoIP device, it's going to support auto provisioning. So why would you want to use auto provisioning? It really makes the setup process so easy because you've already done your due diligence, you've set up all the files correctly, and you just plug and play the units and you're good to go. You know, as close to a toaster as you can get. It requires definitely some work beforehand to get all the templates set up properly and make sure that everything's named correctly. But once you do that, it becomes so easy to go and set up all the different equipment. And one of the nice things is you can use common files. So there's two different file types, and we can kind of get into those a little bit later. I've got a couple slides that'll go over that specifically. But common files can have common settings on there. You know, for example, if you're setting up an elementary school or a middle school and you're deploying, say, 100 speakers, all those speakers are probably going to have the same volume level, or they might have, say, the same NTP server or DNS server settings, you know, unique settings that would be, settings that would be the same across all the different products, not necessarily unique to a particular device, say a device's IP address or the explicit credentials they would need to register with a SIP server. Those would be unique, but common files, you know, if they're going to be shared across multiple devices, you can have that in a single file, which makes it really easy to ensure, say, that all of your speakers are using the same multicast addresses, or they're using the same volumes or the same NTP server. So that way it just takes a lot of the guesswork out of it and makes it a lot easier that you can guarantee if they downloaded that file, they're all going to have the exact same volume settings. And really, after you go and set up auto provisioning, it makes the management of equipment so easy. Where, say, for example, down the line and you're setting up all those speakers, we put out a firmware release. Instead of logging into each individual server and updating the firmware, you throw the firmware file on that auto provisioning server you have and reboot all your devices. They'll check with the server and see that they've got a different version of firmware than what's listed on the server, and they'll download it. So that way you can go and update 100 speakers simultaneously instead of having to go through each one individually, which would really be a chore. That'd take up, you know, even somebody that would be quick like me or one of our support guys, it'd probably take them 2 hours to go through and update the firmware on a whole bunch of different devices manually, whereas you can do it with Autoprov almost instantaneously. It's a really cool process, and it really becomes useful after you get it all set up. It becomes so powerful for management. So where would you want to use auto provisioning is another great question. Really, technically speaking, it can be used by any size of a customer. Whether they've got 10 devices or 1,000 devices, you can really use auto provisioning in any instance. However, it's really best for medium to enterprise deployments when you're dealing with, say, more than 10 units specifically. I find that 10 units is pretty easy to manage on your own. You know, say if you've got, you know, a couple intercoms, a couple speakers, and a horn for the warehouse, it's pretty easy to set up and manage manually. Of course, you could set up auto provisioning for that for the ease of management in the future, but if you're only dealing with a handful of devices, it's not that big of a deal to set them all up manually and manage them manually. But if you're dealing with anything more than 10, say 25 devices, 50 devices, 100, so on and so forth, it becomes so much of a pain to go and update their firmware, change settings if you want to adjust the volume settings, or if you add in different accessories, say one of our strobe kits, you know, and you want to go and set up all the different blink features on there, it becomes really a hassle to go and set all that up for 50 different speakers, where you can do it with an auto provisioning file almost instantaneously. So the more devices that you have really increases the incentive and what you get out of auto provisioning. But it's still useful for any size of a customer. There's just more reason to set it up if you've got more equipment. Now, let's talk a little bit specifically about how to set these different files up. So first and foremost, you're going to need the actual auto provisioning templates or files. Those are distributed with all of our firmware downloads. So if you've downloaded any of the firmware from our website, which are available on the individual product pages underneath the specific serial number range of that particular product, say for our intercoms, their outdoor single button intercom, it would be under the firmware tab and serial number 1862XXXXX. And you can get that full file there, and it's going to have basically all the different features that you could manipulate through the web page. You can set through the auto provisioning file. if you don't want to go through and download that, the template is also available on the Autoprov tab of the device itself. So if you go there, you'll see not only all the different information that you can set up to point the device to the auto provisioning server, you'll get a log of what files it's actually downloaded, but you can hit the download template file to download the template, and you get the base template that's available. But you could also just hit the regular export config button on the home page and download the full configured template. That can be useful for, say, for example, you've got that small handful of units and you do want to go through and set up the auto provisioning server, but you've already manually set up all your equipment. Just hit the export config file for every single device, and you've got their pre-configured configuration files available. You name them per the MAC address and throw them on your server. So it makes it really easy to go and get the templates and pretty easy to set up. So next, for the common file, that one's named 00000cd.xml. And that's a file that will be automatically downloaded by any of the devices as they boot up. They basically check for a configuration file that's listed with their MAC address .xml and the common file 00000cd.xml. So that's a really easy way to get those two files to download. And again, for common files, it's really something that would be shared across all of the devices you're setting up. Common settings like NTP, volume, multicast settings, pretty much anything that you would want to be shared across all of your devices, you can set up in a common file. So that way, you know for a fact that all of the files that all the devices that downloaded that file have the exact same configuration values. Then we get to, again, device-specific files, and those are going to be very specific settings. So things like the IP address, if you're setting them up statically, things like their specific SIP registration credentials. They're all going to have different SIP user IDs, SIP auth IDs, and different passwords. So you want to have a unique file so that way not every single speaker downloads that same file and then tries to register all at that same extension. Most servers don't support that, so they all have to be individual, and that's where your device-specific file comes in. But in the device-specific file, what you can also do in the Autoprov section, you can list additional files in there. Now, that's not super duper necessary. You can always just go and load everything into the two files in your common file and your device-specific file. But sometimes you want to have a file that's downloaded by certain devices, not all the devices, and you want an individual file to manage. Say, for example, if you're using one of our keypad intercoms or one of our RFID intercoms where you've got your access control list. Instead of having the access control list embedded into the standard configuration file, you can have that as a separate file that would then be listed in the device-specific file. So that way you can go and manage and manipulate the access list while not having to go and make that change across, say, if you've got 10 different keypad intercoms, make that same change across all the different intercoms. So that way it makes it a lot easier to manage different lists and different specific file sets that you need to go and set up. So there's a lot of different cool features that you can do with that. And then, of course, for firmware files, all you got to do is throw the firmware file on there and keep our normal numbering scheme. And if the firmware file that's loaded on the server doesn't match what the device is currently running, it'll just download it and update. It won't degrade its firmware. Say, for example, if you've got a lower version of firmware than what's currently listed, it knows that it's got a higher version of firmware, so it's not going to degrade itself. But if there's a newer version of firmware, it will go and download that, so it makes it updating firmware across multiple devices really, really easy. So next, how do you actually set up the auto provisioning server? Now that we know how to get the files and how to set up the files, how do you set up the server? So of course you need to pick what type of server you want to use. Again, either the TFTP or the Trivial File Transport Protocol, or the HTTP or HTTPS Hypertext Transport Protocol, secure or not secure. So you basically have to pick the type of server you want to use. In most sense, and especially if you're dealing with stuff that's just on the local premise, TFTP is fine, where you're just going to be downloading regular configuration files across your local network. Not a big deal. You don't have to worry about being too secure about it. But if you do want to be secure, and there's no problem with wanting to do that, you could set up a local HTTP server and have the devices download the files over HTTPS, so everything's secure. So even if you've got, say somebody that's penetrated your network and is just looking for different things that they can steal off your network, it's still all encrypted. But then that process still applies if you're doing something over the open internet. So say, for example, you go and you've got an account with Amazon Prime, or not Amazon Prime, but AWS, and you've got, a couple different options to host something on one of their servers. You could throw up an HTTPS server there and host all your files there and download everything across the internet. And if you're going to do anything across the open internet where it would be open to a man-in-the-middle attack, where someone could go and download your files as they're being sent from point A to point B, being sent from the server to you, if somebody could download those files and potentially steal the information that's on there, you always want to have that encrypted. You never want to send anything over the open internet that's not encrypted, because somebody could steal it. They'll steal anything that they can get their hands on, especially for telecom-related stuff. That opens up so many possibilities for toll fraud and the potential to use your phone system to go and rack up different charges to call all across the world. You really want to make sure that stuff is secure after it's going across the open internet. So once you go and you pick whatever server you want to use, you of course want to get that server set up. There's lots of different ways to set up, say, a TFTP or an HTTP server locally. It would kind of depend on what operating system you're using, or if you're doing it in the cloud, what type of hardware you're working with, and what you're allowed to actually upload on those cloud servers. So after you go and get all that set up, of course you want to collect your different provisioning templates. So like we covered, there's a lot of different ways to download the provisioning templates. The easiest way that I always point to customers is just download the firmware files from our website. The download's really quick. The firmware files usually aren't too big, and usually you can download those files in a couple seconds, and it comes with not only the firmware files, which are good to have just for backup, but also that configuration template. Then you want to go through and set up the templates like you would need to, set up your common files, so that way they've got the different common settings for things like your volume, NTP, multicast, and then your Mac specific or your device specific files that'll contain those unique settings. So things like the device's specific IP address, its registration credentials for the SIP server, maybe unique multicast addresses. Say if you're dealing with a paging adapter and you want it to have, say, different zone settings as compared to a different paging adapter that's in a different segment of the building. So there's lots of different things you can load into the Mac specific configuration files. And of course, once you get all that done and you're sure that you've got all the different device specific files for all your Mac addresses, you just simply load all the files onto the server. So then your server's all ready to go, it's loaded, it's running, everything's good to go. So then finally, how the heck do you make the CyberData devices actually auto-provision? You can go and manually set them up on the Autoprov tab and point it manually to all the different servers. But again, if you're dealing with, say 50, 100 speakers, logging in there just to set up how to point them to that individual server, heck, if you're logging in there to do that, you might as well just set up the whole thing manually. It'll only add another minute or two to that setup. So that's really not a way that I would recommend for somebody to do that, because it takes away that plug and play type scenario where you can just plug in the units and they're automatically going to get set up. And that's really the idea when you're setting up Autoprov or auto provisioning. You want these things to automatically set themselves up, where all you have to do is mount them in place, plug them in, and be done with it. So if that's really the way that you're going and you want to do that, DHCP options are the best way to go about it. And what DHCP is Dynamic Host Control Protocol. Is basically just when you plug a device into the network and it communicates with your router. In most networks, the DHCP server is a router, but in bigger enterprise networks, you'll actually have a dedicated DHCP server. That's what we use at CyberData. We've got kind of our own DHCP server, but we do a lot of testing with it, so we need to have something specific rather than just using, your regular router to handle it. But With your DHCP server, you can set up a whole bunch of different options to actually point to a specific server. So the way that the process goes, the devices will boot up, and as they boot up and the network stuff starts working, they'll reach out on the network and say, hey, I'm this MAC address, I need an IP address. Can you give me one? And the DHCP server will respond, hey, here's your MAC address, here's an IP address, and this IP address is valid for so long. And then also, we've got all these different options set up on the server, and go and check them. So the different options that you can play with are option 43, option 66, option 72, and option 150, and they all function a little bit differently. So for option 43, what that does is that gives you the capability to list an FQDN, or fully qualified domain name, or an IP address specifically of an HTTP or HTTPS server. So that's really useful, again, if you're going for the HTTP or HTTPS style of a server that would either be local, so you could use your IP address, or hosted in the cloud for your fully qualified domain name. Then we've got option 66. Option 66 is specifically either the IP address of a TFTP server or a fully qualified domain name of an HTTP server. You can still technically use option 66 to point to an HTTPS server, because the only difference between the HTTP and HTTPS server is how they communicate with the device. And the device really controls that. Typically, most HTTP servers that you set up are going to support just standard HTTP as well as HTTPS for those secure style of connections. And then it's all just up to the device at that point. Now, option 72 is specifically if you're just going to be using an IP address of either that HTTP or HTTPS server. So that's useful if you've got one of those set up on your local network. In that example, where you wanted to be secure, you're not sure if anybody's penetrated your network and could be potentially, siphoning off traffic on your network. It's always better to be secure than not secure. You buy locks for a reason. You might as well use them. So with option 72, it gives you that option to point to that server via an IP address. You can still use an IP address if you're going across the open internet. However, it's most common if you're going to use an IP address, it's done on your local area network. And then finally, for option 150, that points to the IP address of a TFTP server. So that's very easy to use if you're just doing something local. That's commonly what I would use when I was doing Autoprov to go and set up a lot of our stuff for our trade show setups. I would use option 150 to just go and point to the TFTP server on my laptop that I was running it on to download all the different files. So there's a lot of different options in terms of what a DHCP server can point to. And it gives you a lot of different options to automatically make the devices auto-provision themselves or autoprov themselves. It really gives you that plug-and-play capability where you plug them in, they get an address off the network, and then they just go and set themselves up. So, in conclusion, should I use Autoprov? It does take a decent amount of work to set up. It's definitely cumbersome. If you have to go up and set up, say, 50 units, 100 units, that's 50 to 100 templates that you have to set up, which gets even more complicated if you're setting up things like our keypad intercoms and you want to do access control and you've got access lists. And then, oh my gosh, if you throw in additional levels of access lists, say one that would have fewer users than other users, say you've got a keypad intercom not only at your front door, but you've got one of our secure keypads, which is just a keypad for, say, a supply closet that would need its own configuration file. It can get really, really complicated, and it can be a decent amount of work to set up all these different templates and files to go and actually auto-provision your devices. It's not really a downside, but it's just something to consider. You're going to have to do that work either way, whether you have to manually set them up, which is going to take just as much work, arguably more, because then you have to deal with web pages loading, reboots, all that good stuff. It takes a little bit more time to actually set stuff up manually, but setting up Autoprov files isn't, say, something you can do in 5 or 10 minutes. Unless you're really quick, it's going to take a little bit of time to get all that set up. However, after you go and you invest all that time in setting all that up, it makes management of the equipment so much easier as you go forward. It's really time well spent, because after you go and set up all those different files, all your common files, it makes it really easy to adjust settings as you go and tweak your paging system to be perfect for the environment. So you set up all your speakers to play at volume level 5, and things are good, but in certain classrooms you get a rowdy bunch of kids and they get kind of loud, and maybe, okay, let's, instead of volume 6, let's crank it to volume 7. It makes it really, really easy to do that across all your speakers immediately, just by using Autoprov in the common file settings. So that way you can go to make the one change to the file, reboot that switch so all the devices go and reboot and pull all the different files, and go and automatically all update their volume settings. So it makes management so much easier in the future. All that time you spent setting up those files is so, so worth it as the system ages. And it gets, it ages like a fine wine. It just gets better over time. And again, when you're dealing with more units, as you add more units to your deployment, it really increases the incentive to go and set something this up, because it just becomes more and more of a daunting task as you go from, say, 50 units to 75 to 100. Or gosh, if you're dealing with a giant deployment, you're dealing with 250 speakers, that could literally take all day to set those up manually. Whereas with Autoprov and setting it up and doing your due diligence takes a couple hours to invest there, then it makes the system so, so easy to manage. So as you increase the number of devices that are going to be managed by this auto provisioning server, it increases the incentive and what you get out of that time investment. So it's really, really worthwhile as the more devices you add. But with that, it becomes not super realistic for small deployments. Again, if you're just a small mom and pop shop, you've got, say, a couple, say 2 IP66 horns and an intercom for your backdoor for deliveries, you're dealing with, 3 units. Heck, set them all up manually. It really doesn't take that much time, and for stuff like that, you're really going to set it and forget it, or you're not going to need to change any particular settings as you go and set something up. They really just kind of stick with the settings there. Say for example, you're a mom and pop shop that's got 2 IP66 horns and they're in your garage bays. You do oil changes and smog checks. You're really not going to need to change the volume settings ever on your IP66 horns. You pretty much go run your air compressors, figure out how loud the thing is, and adjust your volume settings. And when you're done with that, you're really not going to need to play with it too much. So you wouldn't ever need to make changes to it. So it really wouldn't warrant going and setting up an Autoprov server. You could, but it really won't take that much time to go and manually adjust the settings on your own. Or if you're only updating, say, the firmware on 2 devices, that's easy. You can do that in less than 5 minutes. So it's a really, really easy way to go and set up 2 devices. So what I always tell customers is it's usually about 10 units or so where it becomes the best time to go and set up auto provisioning. You don't have to with 10 units. Somebody that's quick, like me, or people that work in our support department that spend so much time doing auto provisioning or just regular provisioning of our equipment, manually setting them up, you can get pretty quick at it. But when you're dealing with more than 10, say you got 20, 25, 100, that's where it really becomes important and useful to use Autoprov. And in situations like that, you should use Autoprov. So finally, one thing that I like to do when we cover different terms that we might not necessarily go over in other meetings is just kind of go over some of the terms that we use today. So, of course, Autoprov is just short for auto provisioning, which is just a way to automatically set up the devices by downloading their configuration template. You probably got that after sitting through this half an hour. You probably know what Autoprov is by now. Next, we have TFTP, or Trivial File Transfer Protocol, which is just an insecure way of downloading files across the local network. You don't really care about the files being sent plain text where anybody can read them. You're just concerned about getting the file from point A to point B. You want to get it on the device. That's the best time to use that. Then you've got HTTP, or Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and HTTPS, Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure. The only difference between those two is, of course, HTTPS is secure. It uses TLS to go and ensure the encryption. It uses a pretty high level of encryption. HTTPS is, for example, the same thing that you would see probably on your YouTube channel that you're watching, where you're watching this video right now. Up in your address bar, you'll see a nice little lock right next to the URL of the website. That means that you're using HTTPS. Our devices can download the files over HTTPS. So it just ensures that everything is secure when something is being downloaded with that particular protocol. And that's most commonly used when you're doing something over the open internet, again, because of that possibility of it being secure, but that doesn't mean you can't set it up locally. It's pretty common, especially for some kind of coders or kind of network gurus to go and have their own HTTP server set up locally. Say for a local intranet, if you're going to have a file system that people can use locally at the business, or if you've got, say, a web server running on your PC to download different funny cat videos or cat pictures or something like that. There's a lot you can do with HTTP servers, and they can be really, really powerful to go and load your Autoprov settings in there. Next, we've got DHCP, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, and that's just the process that pretty much all tech devices will use to get an IP address by default. Your iPhone will use it, your Android phone will use it, your PC, your laptop, your iPad, what have you. When you connect them to a network, they'll use DHCP to get an IP address. So that way they can just go across the network and get that address, so that way they can communicate with all the devices on the local area network. And where DHCP comes in this scenario, of course, is not only to get the IP address to be able to communicate with stuff, but it also allows the use of DHCP options to go and point to different locations where those files might be located. So you can set up that true plug and play type scenario where you plug in a device and it gets its DHCP address, sees that it has a couple DHCP options, checks those options, finds some configuration files, downloads them, and hits the ground running. So that way they're ready to go as soon as you plug them in. Next, we've got MAC addresses, and MAC addresses are specific hardware addresses of the device. They're basically a string of numbers and letters that are a unique identifier for every single device. And this is an identifier that a typical user can't set, and it's actually set by the manufacturer when the device is created. All the different manufacturers, even us here at CyberData, we pay for a series of MAC addresses that we can issue to all our devices. Same thing goes with your iPhone, with your Android phone, your PC. Basically, any device that can communicate on a network is going to have a MAC address. And then the final term that we covered today is FQDN, or Fully Qualified Domain Name. And the easiest way to think about that, what's an FQDN? That's Google, that's Facebook. All these different terms for websites that we know are just fully qualified domain names. And those are basically just names of websites that are understandable by humans and a lot easier to remember than, say, 8.8.8.8 or whatever Google, whatever Google or Facebook's IP address is. They're just FQDNs, or fully qualified domain names, that translate to that IP address, so that way the device can reach out to that particular IP address.
Thank you for watching this edition of CyberSchool. If you have any questions, please get in contact with our sales department. They're available by email at sales@cyberdata.net or by phone at 831-373-2601 extension 334. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe for more content like this from CyberData.